Hi everybody. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about the place value chart. So I've got one here where I've got some of the place values listed. So with our decimal point, right after the decimal point we have the tenths, the hundredths, and then the thousandths. And then of course right before the decimal point we have the ones, and then the tens and the hundreds. And in both directions I could keep going on the place value chart. So we're going to look at some decimal numbers today and how we read them and how we write them. You know, we can even compare decimal numbers. So first we're going to look at a model. So with this model here, I've got 100 individual squares. And the model represents one whole. So if this represents one whole and I've got 100 squares, if I want to write the part that's shaded as a fraction, I could write it as 2/10, or I'm sorry, 200, since there's 100 total here. So this would be 200, and then written as a decimal, since it's 200, I need the 2 to be in the hundredths place, and then I go ahead and put a 0 in the tenths place. So this is what 200 would look like as a decimal. And I could also put a 0 here to show that there's not a whole number. So decimals represent parts of numbers. So again, you know, this one's going to be 200ths, and then as a decimal, remember whatever place value the last digit is in, that's the name that we say. So the 2 had to be in the hundredths place for it to represent 200ths. So now we're going to look at another one. So this time I've got 10 shaded. So there's a couple of different ways that I could write this. I could write it as 10 hundredths, or if you'll remember, it takes 10 hundredths to make a tenth. So I could also write this as 1/10. And you know, just to prove that these are equivalent, you know, if I divide both of these by 10, dividing by 10 over 10, that's like dividing by 1, I get 1/10. So if I write this as a decimal, I could write it as 10 hundredths, or I could just write it as 1/10. So again, these are equivalent. And so what you need to remember is it takes 10 of the smaller place value to make the larger place value. So just like it took 10 hundredths to make a tenth, it would take 10 tenths to make a 1. So if I had 10 tenths, that would make a 1. So if this, you know, were completely shaded in, I would have 1. But right now, I've got a number less than 1. So 1/10, or I could say it as 10 hundredths. All right, and so we're going to look at one more model. So now you can see I've got 1/10 shaded, and then I've got 5 hundredths. So as a decimal, I would write this with the 1 in the tenths place and then the 5 in the hundredths place. So I could also read this as 15 hundredths, which if I wrote it as a fraction, I could write it as 15 over 100. All right, so we're going to do just a few more examples now. And so I'm going to use this place value chart, and I'm just going to put some numbers on there. So if I had 3 in the ones place, then a 2 in the tenths place, and then I've got a 6 in the hundredths place. So the way that I would read this, I would say the 3, then when I come to the decimal point I say and. So 3 and 26, and because this last digit is in the hundredths place, I say hundredths. So it would be 3 and 26 hundredths. Now if I took away the 6, this would just be 3 and 2 tenths, because the last digit now is in the tenths place. I could also put a digit in the thousandths place. So now I've got 3 and 261 thousandths. Since the last digit is in the thousandths place, you know, I would read this number as if there weren't a decimal point. So I say 261, but then I have to remember to say the thousandths place. And if I didn't have a whole number, if I just had this, and you know, you can put a 0 here, you don't have to. This would just be 261 thousandths. I don't have to say 0 and, I can just say 261 thousandths. And then let's look at one other example on here. You know, if I put a 0 here, I could say 3 and 260 thousandths, which this 0 doesn't change the value. If I took away the 0, 3 and 26 hundredths is the same thing as 3 and 260 thousandths. All right, so we're going to look at one other thing, and that is writing the decimal in expanded form. So I've got this decimal number now, 16 and 234 thousandths. So if I write it in expanded form, I'm going to take each place value. So the 1 is in the tens place, so I'm going to say 1 times 10. And just to keep up with it, I'm going to put parentheses around it. The 6 is in the ones place, so I'm going to say 6 times 1. And then for our decimal numbers, we do the same thing. The 2 is in the tenths place, so 2 times 1/10. And then the 3 is in the hundredths place, so 3 times 100th. And then I've got a 4 in the thousandths place, so 4 times 1,000th. Now each of these decimal notations, I could have also written them as fractions. So I could have written it as 1/10, 100th, and 1,000th. So you may see it written as decimals or as fractions. So that's how we write our numbers in expanded form. And then over here on the side, I just have some reminders. You know, if I have, in all of these numbers, I don't have whole numbers. So that's why I've got a 0 in the ones place. Then in this one, I've got 0 tenths, and then I've got 5 hundredths. So the way I would say this would just be 5 hundredths. The one right below, since I've got 5 in the tenths place, it's going to be 5 tenths. And then I have right here 50 hundredths. And notice 50 hundredths and 5 hundredths, or actually, I'm sorry, this is actually read as 50 thousandths. So this one would be 50 thousandths. Since we've got a 0 here in the thousandths place, we can say 50 thousandths. So 50 thousandths and 5 hundredths are going to be equivalent. This 0 doesn't change the value. And then here we've got just 5 thousandths, because the 5 is in the thousandths place. But remember on this one, the 5 is in the hundredths place, so we would either read it as 5 hundredths or we could say 50 thousandths. Alright, so you're going to have some practice problems now on the Google form, and our mystery word for today is kindness. So if you have questions, let me know, and then just work on your form. You can look back at the video and always do your best.